Pull out your cowboy hats and revolvers. It's time for the SWAC's Wild Wild West to be settled. Oh yeah, it's Locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked on HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked on HBCU podcast, your number one. Daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor. Thank you for going on this journey with me, making Locked on HBCU your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey is over. It just means it's time to follow me on Twitter, at @SouthExclusive, which you can find right here at the bottom of the screen on the lower third. And don't forget the S if you are on the audio side of things. Now, the Wild Wild West is exactly what we have in the unconcluded division of the SWAC. Yes, we know that Jackson State will be representing the East, but we don't know who they'll be playing in the SWAC championship game. Now, prior to this season, I went on Fox 54 with Mo Carter. Thankful for that. Shout out my guy Mo. Y'all know he's doing great content, and he's came on the show before, so y'all know him. But I went on Fox 54 with Mo Carter, and he asked me who I thought was going to win the West. And when he asked that question, he labeled it as the Wild Wild West. At the time, I just said, you know what? That's just a play on words. It's just something people say. Little did I know that at the end of the year, it was going to look like the Wild Wild West. There's no conclusion. There's no certainty on who's going to win this conference. I have an idea of who I think is going to win, and I will give you this. I'm going to paint the full picture. I'm going to tell you what everybody needs to do, where everybody sits right now, and then also what I think is going to happen. So I'm going to give it all. So if you are a Prairie View fan, a Texas Southern fan, a Southern fan, an Alcorn fan, you all stand a chance to win the SWAC West and face Jackson State in the championship game. Now, most of you either have or will, if you're talking about Alcorn, play Jackson State. Prairie View is the only one that hasn't. And of course, Jackson State is undefeated. So they have beat Southern and Texas Southern, and we'll see what they do with Alcorn. We'll get into that. But these are the four teams that have really been in contention all year. And no matter what the ups or downs were, they all stand a chance now. And I don't think that if you would have asked most people 2, maybe 3 weeks ago, I can't remember the schedule exactly in my head of when everything transpired, but specifically 2 weeks ago, after Jackson State beat Southern, I'll say that. After Jackson State beat Southern, I don't know if you would have sat here and said all four of these teams were going to be in the hunt. Maybe Southern, you thought could still be in the hunt, but not all four of these teams, especially not Alcorn. So where do they sit today? What are they going to be playing, or who are they going to be playing this Saturday? So Prairie View is going to be going against Mississippi Valley State. Southern does have a bye week. They'll be playing in the Bayou Classic next week. So they're not in complete sit and wait mode, but they are in a position where, yeah, we don't know what's going to happen this week. We have to wait and see, but we still have to take care of business. So they still have another game to be played. Texas Southern is facing Alabama A&M, and Alcorn is facing Jackson State, as I mentioned earlier. Here's the thing, is that Prairie View has pretty much been the front runner for the last couple of weeks. Southern is the team that was the front runner, and I think a lot of people felt, and maybe still do feel, they did beat PV, are the best team in this division. But the thing is, they lost to Texas Southern, and then they lost to Jackson State, and that's all it takes right now, right? So they lost to one other team. Who else did they lose? No, they beat Alcorn. No, they lost to Alcorn. Who did Southern lose to? If you can remember who Southern lost to, off the top of my head, I don't know. I am drawing a complete blank on who they lost to. Oh, they just lost to FAMU. I know I was going to get it. They just lost to FAMU. That was their third loss, right? I'm sitting there thinking, like, I know they didn't lose to anybody in the West. I vividly remember them beating the other two teams in the West. But yes, so they lost 3 games. Texas Southern lost 3 games. It was looking like it's PV's to lose, and it still is. They have the easiest route. If you ask me who had the easiest route and who had the hardest route, I'm going to say that PV is like a hummock. You can get over that pretty easily. But then you look at a mountain, and that's Alcorn. So let's get into these routes. Wow, my seat really went down, guys. This is for my video people. Y'all probably just saw me consistently just dropping. And I thought, man, I don't know. I got to get a new chair. It's time for me to get a new chair, man. I was just going down. I was just sinking. I saw my head start. I looked at the screen again. I'm 2 feet lower. Anywho, here are the tiebreaker situations. So PV wins if they just win. They're the only people who just need to win. And then they also win if the division, if they lose and they tie with Texas Southern. They already beat TSU. Southern wins, Southern the Jaguars in Louisiana, they win if it's a 2-team tie with them in Prairie View or a 3-team tie with them in Alcorn and Prairie View. TSU wins if it's just a tie between, or if it's a 3-way tie between Prairie View and Southern and them. And then also a 4-way tie between all the teams. And Alcorn only wins. The only way they win is if PV wins and they tie with PV. So to make it all simple, right? Because that's just a bunch of if this and this and this and this, it might be a mouthful. It might be a lot like, okay, you're just listing things. Let's make it very simple if you're a fan base or if you're just curious of how it happens. PV, you win and you're in, period. That's the easiest route. I'm just going to keep it simple. You win and you're in. Southern, you need to win, and you need Texas Southern to lose. Right? Everybody else needs PV to lose. I'm not going to keep saying PV needs to lose, right? Southern, you need to win, and you need TSU to lose. If you're Alcorn, you need everybody to lose, and you need to win. PV and Alcorn have the simplest task. It's just one is significantly more difficult, but they have the simplest to understand. And then good old TSU, who I did not think stood a chance, especially after knowing they had Jackson State on their schedule. They need to win, and they need Southern to win. Right? That's it. Everybody needs PV to lose, except for PV. It's just that simple, and that's what you should be rooting for. So what do I think is going to happen? I think PV wins this division. I think that they will be facing off against Jackson State for the second year in a row. I think that TSU stands the second best odds, and that's because though them and Southern both need the same amount of things to happen, right? They both need the same amount of things to happen. I just think one's more realistic. I think that TSU, honestly, I think all of these teams win except for Alcorn. I think Alcorn loses to Jackson State, but I think everybody else wins. They all are the favorite. They deserve to be the favorite. TSU deserves to be the favorite over Alabama A&M. Southern deserves to be the favorite over Grambling. And yes, I think both of those teams could lose those games, but I do think both of them win, right? It wouldn't shock me if everybody wins except for Alcorn, and I think PV should beat Mississippi Valley. Now, the beautiful part about this is they're all basically at the same time except for Southern, who plays next week. So you won't have to worry about a TSU being lifeless. You won't have to worry about them being depleted or disappointed because they know that this game doesn't matter anymore. Alcorn, they're going to try to beat Jackson State no matter what. Like that's not even a conversation, right? Even if there was nothing on the line, you're getting amped up for this game. But TSU might say, man, we wanted to win the division. Now we can't. Of course, they're playing for the first winning season in 22 years. So that's still something to play for no matter what. But you could see a little bit of a letdown if you know that your conference isn't even in your reach anymore. Luckily, that's not the case. All of these games are going to be around the same time. So we will see spirited football all around the SWAC. And I'll tell you right now, I am geeked up. I cannot wait for this action. I have the best odds going PV, TSU, Southern, Alcorn. If you're talking about winning the SWAC West, but I do think that PV gets it done by knocking off Mississippi Valley State in the last game of their season. And going forward, we're going to be switching gears. We're not going to talk about actual game action. We're going to talk about former HBCU players who have now been drafted into the XFL because they did have their draft for the season that's coming up in the spring. Make sure you tune in. There's some good football, but I want to tell you about some players that you might want to see. Before we get into that, however, today's episode is brought to you by Nugenics. And listen, as men, sometimes when we get older, you naturally just start to lose testosterone. You don't produce as much, right? It's natural. Ain't no shame about it. It happens to a lot of men. But I know a lot of people want to get back. For years and centuries, really, they've looked for the fountain of youth. I found it. We call it Nugenics. They give you that testosterone boost because who doesn't want to feel like their old self? Who doesn't want to feel like the warrior? You want to get in the gym and you want the gains to be how they used to be. You want the progress in the body that you used to have when you were younger. Well, now with Nugenics, you can produce testosterone, so that's not an excuse anymore. Right? It's been backed by 5 different clinics. It's the #1 selling testosterone booster at GNC. This thing is absolutely phenomenal, and I want to help you out. I want to get you a complimentary bottle if you would allow me. So get a complimentary bottle of Nugenics Total T when you text college to 231231. Text now and get a bottle of Nugenics Thermo, their most powerful fat incinerator ever, with key ingredients to help you get back in shape fast. Absolutely free, but you have to text college to 231-231. Text college to 231-231. Texting enrolls you in recurring automated text messages. Consent not required to purchase. Message and data rates do apply. As we keep on rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making us your first listen of the day. Every day, I appreciate so much being a part of your daily routine. Another person who needs to be in there is Peter Bukowski and all of the guests that he does bring on Locked On Sports Today, the local experts who are going to break down the biggest national stories. Wherever you're listening to me right now, you can also get Locked On Sports Today. And today's word of the day is one that I have already used, and it is hummock, right? So I was pretty proud. I ain't gonna lie. When I used that word, I was like, ooh, I used that pretty smoothly. But a hummock means a small round hill or a mound. I use that as PV's small hill to try to get over to win the SWAC West compared to the mountain that Alcorn needs to use. But that's our word of the day, and we've used it already. Now I want to move into something different. I want to talk about the XFL because they did just have their draft. They did just pick their players, and they had a unique way of drafting. So it wasn't just these are the picks, run it. It was these are the sections. These are the picks. So you had a quarterback section. You had a skill position section. You had an offensive line section, defensive back section. You had so many different sections where you knew who was going to be the group of players who were going to be picked at that time frame. It's just about what position you were going to pick and things of that nature, right? So QB was obvious. Then when it came to skill position, we're going to pick a running back first. The running back was actually the first overall pick, but then a lot of people went with wide receivers after that. And we'll talk about an HBCU running back who was selected. I'm not going to break down or tell you or list everybody. That would be way too long. And then also it just wouldn't be entertaining to hear me just list name after name after name with no context behind it. Instead, I would like to just give you the prominent people who were picked. And I think that when you're talking about prominence in football, you can't. I was going to use a double negative, but I ain't feel like it this time. I don't mind double negatives. I don't know how y'all feel about them. I'll use a double negative for emphasis. I don't have a problem, right? Now I feel like I built up this moment. Now I feel like I have to use the double negative, but I'm not. So, but when you're talking about prominence in football, I think it's impossible to not start with quarterbacks. That should be one of, if not the first position that jumps into your mind when you say prominence in football. It's the most important position on the field. And there's a whole, there's a whole backstory. We all know it about black quarterbacks, right? So when you have a couple of black quarterbacks, which we did today, specifically those who came from HBCUs, I do think it's important to highlight that they were selected. You had Juwan Pass and Deondre Francois. And Francois was selected to be a backup, but you can only pick 2, right? So there's only 8 teams. So you have 16 quarterbacks. It's only 2 a team. That's still impressive. And you still have the opportunity, of course, to fight for a position instead of not being drafted at all. So it's still a huge deal. And Francois came from Hampton, and then he ended up going to Florida State, but he started off at Hampton, and he was playing very well. Obviously, you don't play like a Rudy Poo and then transfer to a bigger school. It just does not work like that. You have to establish some value when you're coming from a smaller school, so you know that you're hooping. Anytime a guy goes from a smaller school to a bigger school, you know he's hooping, right? And then you have Juwan Pass. And Juwan Pass was drafted to be a starter. So let's give a round of applause for Mr. Pass from Prairie View up 290. I think it was an important move for me, at least. I don't know about everybody else. But I thought it was an important move for them to have HBCU representation at the quarterback position. I'm not saying it was picked for this purpose, but as as it happened, I realized the importance, because now HBCU quarterbacks have a place to go, right? You look at a player like, I think it was DeAndre Johnson a couple of years ago, who played at Texas Southern for a year. He was a representative on either the USFL or I think it was the USFL. But I thought that was important. And those are the two players from the quarterback position who did have the opportunity, or who do have the opportunity, to make noise. Pass is already the starter. It is his job to lose, while Francois is the backup, and he still has much time to get after it and get that starting position. We've seen quarterback play in these leagues. They aren't always the greatest. They are up for the grabs a lot of times. So it wouldn't shock me if Francois has the opportunity to get in there and show what he is capable of. Now let's go to a couple of other notable players, and I have two. Will Adams. He was selected by the Vegas Vipers in round 19 of the defensive skill position. So Adams is an interesting player to me. The reason Adams is interesting is because he got so much notoriety from the HBCU combine. And I still think that his athletic gifts give him the opportunity to make a segue into the NFL. I have him on a list of players who, it would not shock me after this, if they put up good film, make it to the NFL. I was there at the HBCU combine. I was right next to scouts. They were amazed watching his shuttle. They were amazed watching his broad jump. I watched their reaction, and I can tell how they marveled at his physical gifts, that this is a player who I'd rather deal with a physical specimen who I can mold into a better football player than somebody who just doesn't have the gifts, because they have something I can work with. If you have the explosiveness, I feel like I can teach you a couple of other things, right? Of course, I want the technique guy who knows everything he's doing, but I'd rather you have physical gifts and lack technique than lack both, right? Because now I can do something with it. I can actually do something with you. And I think that's the way that they saw Will Adams. And that's why he spent a little bit of time on the Commanders practice squad. I don't know when he was released off the practice squad, but I did hear the news about him getting on. And I believe that with some good film here, and showing that those physical gifts are translatable to something outside of the collegiate game, I do believe that he stands a chance to make it into the NFL. And speaking of making it to the NFL, this guy right here, Jah Maine Martin, there's a lot of people who feel like he should be on some sort of roster, whether that's practice squad or not, in some capacity. And, I think he had some time with the Colts, a tryout, maybe he just didn't make it. But in 2019 for North Carolina A&T, and Adams came from Virginia State, but in 2019 for North Carolina A&T, Martin was going ridiculous. 23 touchdowns, 22 on the ground, 10 of those touchdowns were for 55 yards or more. So he has the ability to get into the end zone a lot. We always are going to appreciate that. But then he also has the ability to break loose and have big plays. So he's a guy who is very talented. He's the guy who continues the long list of talented North Carolina A&T running backs that they really had over the last decade specifically. I'm thinking about three in my mind: Tariq Cohen, Jah Maine Martin, and then now Bashul Tootin. I'm just like, oh, you got him playing, and he was drafted in the 5th round. He will be the starting running back as long as health is there and as long as he can protect his spot. He was the first running back picked by the Orlando Guardians. They're hoping he can get back to his 2019 form. And if he can play like he played in 2019, there is absolutely no doubt that this man is an NFL caliber running back. Right, we saw Turpin from the USFL get on as a kick returner. Now he's playing for the Dallas Cowboys right now. We know that these leagues can translate. PJ Walker is now in Carolina right now, playing and winning games on Thursday Night Football. These leagues aren't just like middle ground. They are stepping stones for a lot of players to show what they can do and then get an opportunity on the biggest of stages. And I think that Martin and Adams both have a unique opportunity, one from previous production in 2019 and one from just the reaction of NFL scouts and just his physical gifts. I think both could end up translating and, moving on to the NFL after this season. Fingers crossed that both of them, fingers crossed that all 4 of these guys and multiple others that I did not name all get that opportunity. But these 2 specifically, I do think stand a really good chance. And going forward, we're going to talk about the games that did not quite make the game of the week cut. The HBCU top 10 has been pretty much the same for the last 2 weeks, so I didn't really want to touch on it, but I did want to talk about our games of the week that are very important. They just ain't number one. Before I get into that, today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. Look at the bottom of the screen, please. BetOnline, right? Find all the latest odds, news, and scores. But here's the thing about BetOnline. They have the best odds, props, and lines than ever before. Y'all know about that. We tell you that at the beginning of some of the episodes. But here's my thing, is that football season is in full go. The stakes are high. At this point, you know what your team is. You know what all of these teams are. We have nearly 10 games in. You know who these guys are. Put your money down. You can make some money. I think one of the most interesting games this week is going to be Minnesota versus Dallas. I don't know who you think is going to win, but go ahead and put your money down on it. And make sure you're doing it on BetOnline. The NBA season is kicking in. Will the Nets ever get it together? Will my Pels continue their 3-game winning streak and make it 4 or 5 and so on and so forth? We'll see. But I hope that when you're putting some money down and taking a risk and making some money. It's a low amount of risk because they keep you educated, but it's a high amount of reward because they make you get paid. It's just that simple. Go to BetOnline where the game starts. As wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, we're going to be talking about our games of the week that did not quite make the cut. We know what the game of the week is going to be. I knew from the beginning, but these are still some very important games, and I don't want to highlight them as individuals because, yes, I could, and they are all important games as individuals, but I think it's best to group them, right? Because if I listed them, I could probably do a whole show based upon games of the week that just did not make the cut. There are so many important games. There are 2, 5, 6, 7 important, really important games of the week this week. 8 if I wanted to include the FAMU versus Bethune-Cookman game. Like, there are a lot of important games this week. But I'm only going to break it down, and I'm going to give you about 6, but I'm going to group them together. Number 1 group is the Division II playoffs. We're here, right? It's Virginia Union versus Wingate. It's Fayetteville State versus Delta State. It's do or die. Ain't no, oh, man, I had a rough game. I'm going to get them next week, though. No. You lose, you're done. You're going home. The stakes are as high as they will ever be. This isn't basketball. It's not a best of 7. It's not a best of 3. This is one game, single elimination, do or die. Of course, these HBCUs have 2 opposite sides of the spectrum that they're dealing with. One is Virginia Union playing Wingate, 4 versus 5. The closest matchup. Then you have Fayetteville State playing Delta State. That's the farthest of matchups, 2 versus 7. And Virginia Union should be fun because I think that Jada Byers, and I know we talk about Jackson State and Shedeur Sanders is the leader for this, but I truly feel like Jada Byers has a phenomenal case for being the Black College Football Player of the Year. The things he's done for Virginia Union this year are so special that he does warrant consideration. I think it's him and Shedeur Sanders, 1 and 2. It just depends on how you want to do it. And if Byers were to win, I wouldn't be mad. I would not be mad at all. There would be some people who are mad, but this dude has been going crazy. He's probably going to have over 2,000 total yards at the running back position. So I definitely feel like he deserves a case. And if he starts playing really well, has one of his biggest games in the playoffs, this conversation is going to be a lot different. I'm just going to keep it like that. It's going to be a lot different. And I think more people are going to start, I know he's D2, but a lot of people are going to start giving him the credit and saying, okay, well, this is one of the best, if not the best season by an individual player in Black college football. Great game or great player. Then you look at Fayetteville State, who they got to play Delta State, who's the number 1 seed in this region for a long time until they faltered in one game towards the end of the year. It'd be a big upset. It's not that it can't happen. It didn't happen last year, but you look at 2019, it happened twice, I think, at least 2 times. The 7th seed knocked off the 2 seed. So it's a tall task. It would be the biggest upset, but at the same time, we've seen it happen. It's definitely doable. And then the next group I want to talk about, and I'm not going to touch on too much, it's the 4 or the 3 games that I talked about earlier. Alcorn versus Jackson State, Texas Southern versus Alabama A&M, Prairie View versus Mississippi Valley State. None of these games as individuals are enough to be on this list. I'm just going to be honest with you. Maybe the Alcorn-Jackson State game for the rival side of things. But for the most part, none of these games are individually big enough to be considered, right? I'm not overly excited to watch PV versus Mississippi Valley State, right? I think PV is going to win that game. I'm not overly excited to see TSU versus Alabama A&M if I take my alumni hat off. Like, these aren't making me jump, right? And neither one of them really jump above the other. But when you look at the stakes that are at hand for all of them, they are all big-time games. All of them. So I'm not going to touch on them because I already did that in the first segment, but I did feel like I needed to highlight it. And then lastly, you have Howard versus Morgan State. And this is the biggest game in the MEAC. And you might have thought that the MEAC wasn't going to have no more big games after North Carolina Central won. You might have thought that was the case. This is the one big game in the MEAC this year or this weekend for me. All those other games, I don't really care. Like Delaware State playing Campbell. I'm mad I forgot about that game when I was talking about Campbell versus HBCUs. But it ain't really moving me, right? Like it's not a big game. We know Delaware State isn't going to do anything. South Carolina State versus Norfolk, that's just a battle for who's going to be last place. I mean, I guess you won't call it a big game, but not really. This Morgan State versus Howard game, though it does not decide who is going to win the MEAC because that's already wrapped up. It's Central. They can rest their players if they want to, right? That's why that game doesn't move me against Tennessee Tech. No, whatever. The reason this is important is because this is 2 versus 3. Now, Norfolk State could win and Howard could lose, and then it'd be like a big mashup for who actually gets the third place team. And I don't know how the tiebreakers work, but for the most part, I think that I think that Morgan State is going to be the third seed because I think SC State takes care of Norfolk. This is second place versus third place, trying to decide who's going to have second and who's going to have third place. And that's what's so exciting about this, because Howard is playing to make sure that, yeah, we started terribly, but once we got in the conference season, we picked it up. We went 4-1. We really turned things around. This is a battle to see who can reflect upon this season so fondly. And I had no expectations for Damon Wilson. I don't think anybody should have, but I don't think many people who did have expectations thought they would be second place in the MEAC. And that's exactly what happens if they win this game. You have a winning record in the MEAC in your first season with Damon Wilson. This is a big game for both of them. One wants to see the complete flip of their season from the start to the finish. Because it started cold, you ended like blazing, right? You just upset you couldn't knock off North Carolina Central. And you look at Morgan State finishing second place in the MEAC this year, which is what they would do if they knocked off Howard, would be an immediate statement and put everybody on the conference or in the conference on notice that we coming. That includes the champions, North Carolina Central. In the first year with Damon Wilson, Morgan State became the second place team in the MEAC. I told you, I think they're going to win the conference within the next 3 years. And I think this would really put everybody on notice and be like, oh, yeah, that Mouth of the South guy, he might know what he's talking about, because Morgan State had a fantastic year in the first season. That is what is on the line between Howard and Morgan State. But I appreciate you for making us your first listen of the day every single day. Truly do appreciate it. For your second listen of the day, stay on this platform, whatever platform you're on, it doesn't matter. Because he is everywhere. And that is Locked On Sports, hosted by Peter Bukowski, bringing on local experts to talk about the national stories. Make that your second listen of the day. For tomorrow's episode, we're going to be breaking down North Carolina A&T versus Gardner-Webb. It is the Big South Championship, and it's do or die, just like a playoff game. In the meantime, in between time, if you're looking for me, you can find me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.